We really thank you for all coming out on a rainy night, attending tonight to listen to two great presentations about invasive species in Illinois by a couple of experts. But before we launch into the program, I gotta fix this because standing on my toes just isn't working. Maybe that'll work. Does that work?
Better?
I think that's better.
Is that better for you?
Yeah, I think I met her. She was the one that gave me the number who got a call.
Okay, thank you very much. Yay. So before we launch into the program, I just thought I'd give you a little bit of a background from my perspective of what got us here tonight. Before I moved to Menard County in 2014, I lived in southern Illinois, the home of Shawnee National Forest. Many of you probably know about the Shawnee. I lived there for over 25 years. And to be sure, while the Shawnee has its fair share of invasive species, there exists really thousands of acres of forested land, public and private, that are virtually pristine compared to what we have here in Menard County. So you might imagine how surprised I was when I moved here and discovered that the state park just a couple miles down the road from my house that I bought in Petersburg was absolutely, completely infested with honeysuckle and other invasive species. The other thing I discovered when I moved here was Menard County Trails and Greenways. And the organization, I felt really, I really embraced the organization, and I felt like it really embraced me. And I met lots of people who shared my concern for invasive species in our forested land, and learned that a lot of them were removing invasive species, had removed them from their private land. They were working on conservation lands. So I found some kindred spirits, and eventually we decided collectively to start a project, to try to start a volunteer project to remove invasive species from our beloved park. We just felt like it was a logical extension. It was a logical thing to do for our organization, a logical goal for our organization. So tonight's presentation, sorry about that. Tonight's presentation is a logical extension of that goal. And I'm honored tonight to introduce our two speakers. So Chris Evans, down at that table there. He is the Illinois Extension Forester. He's co-chair of the Terrestrial Plants Committee of the Illinois Invasive Species Council, and he is secretary of the Midwest Invasive Plant Network. He specializes in forest health, invasive species, and restoration and management practices of hardwood forests. I met Chris in 2007 when he moved to southern Illinois to direct the river-to-river cooperative weed management area. And although I was already aware of the problems of invasive species by then, it was really Chris who, through his knowledge, his dedication, and his excellent training seminars, who really inspired and encouraged my passion. And Ray Geroff, our other second speaker, who's sitting at that table. He's an Illinois Department of Natural Resources heritage biologist, serving West Central and Western Illinois counties. He specializes in natural area management, endangered and threatened species monitoring and management, prescribed burning, and invertebrate conservation. I met Ray when, out of the blue, he phoned one October day in 2020. He had heard that Trails and Greenways was looking to develop a volunteer project to remove invasive species at New Salem. He told me that the Heritage Division had a volunteer program that he thought we might be interested in, what we might be looking for, and he asked if we would be interested in pursuing a project to restore Cardinal Ridge to its historic character. We said, yes, bring it on. So we got to work on a 5-year plan, management plan, and in 2021, Menard County Trails and Greenways entered into a cooperative agreement with the Illinois Department of Natural Resources to restore a section of high-quality hardwood forest at New Salem State Historic Site. The work is tedious, rewarding, and transformational. But to be successful, a concerted effort to remove invasive plants must be undertaken on a much larger scale. Why? Well, that's the subject of our presentation tonight. So please join me in welcoming our guests, which will, first up will be Chris Evans, and second up will be Ray Geroff. And I would like to ask you, so they both have equal opportunity to give you their words, to hold your questions till the end. So without further ado, Chris, come on up.
There's the button. All righty. Thank you so much, Terry. Can everybody hear me fine? Good enough? No? All right. I'm a little taller than Terry. That better? All righty. Well, I'm very happy to be here, this wonderful venue. This is a really neat place. And talking about a subject that I really enjoy talking about. I've got a feeling I'm talking, what do they say, preaching to the choir a little bit here. I think a lot of you all know quite a bit about invasives, but I'm still going to cover some ground here and really talk about why I think you should be worried about invasive species. What are some of the issues? And then what we as landowners, we as citizens, what we can do to address them. So we do have a problem with invasive species here in Illinois, and really any kind of habitat that you go into, you're going to face invasive species. All of these are known invaders in the state. So if you're a fisherman, if you're a fisher person, sorry, that was a joke from a guy there. If you fish, if you hunt, if you hike, if you just are a landowner, you're going to have to deal with some of these invasive species at one time or other. And that's just one of the problems we have here. There's a lot of different invaders. And so I'm going to start just with a couple basic definitions so that you know what I talk about or what I mean when I say an invasive species. I kind of have a little technical definition. That term gets used a whole lot. You hear some people say, oh, poison ivy is the worst invasive we have. Well, no, not really. And this is kind of why. When I talk about an invasive species, I kind of have a specific definition, right? So it's going to be a species that's not native to that ecosystem. It's not a natural part of that ecosystem. It did not evolve there or migrate there on its own. It's natural or native to somewhere else, but it has been moved there one way or the other, and it's escaped. It's naturalized, and now it's out into this new environment where it was not naturally a part. And then the fact that it's out in the environment, it has to grow or build a population to some level that there's a negative consequence of it being on the landscape. There's something negative that's happening just because it's there. And to me, that's the key. That has to be an invasive. It has to cause some kind of negative impact, some kind of consequence that it's on the landscape and it's doing something we don't like. That's why it's an invasive. There's a lot of exotic species that don't really cause damage. Those aren't invasive, right? So it's just these species that really cause a lot of damage that I consider invasive. Right? And it's kind of all taxa. It's not just plants. I'm kind of a plant geek, so a lot of my pictures, a lot of what I do is plant related, but we have invasive fish. We all know the carp, right? You may have been hit by a carp, a few of you? Oh yeah. I remember the first time I got hit by a carp, it was a life-altering experience. We actually have feral hogs in Illinois, just a few. But actually Illinois, I want to praise Illinois, DNR. They are probably one of the most successful states with keeping feral hogs kind of at bay. They've really done a great job. We have diseases, insects, all these different things. These are all different invasives. Now I'm going to talk mostly about plants because I'm a plant geek. So just a couple other definitions. When we're talking about an invasive plant, if there is a population of an invasive plant in a new area, we call that an infestation. Right? So a population of an invasive, so that's the term we kind of use for that. If that infestation is so big it completely just dominates and it's the only thing growing there, that's called a monoculture, right? The only thing growing there, and that's kind of the worst situation we see invasive species in. And if you look at this picture in the background, that's a monoculture of Japanese stiltgrass. That's just the only thing growing in there, right? And these negative changes, we tend to call those damage. So we say an ecosystem is damaged. That just means that there's something that's changed as a consequence of that plant being on the landscape. So it's an alteration that's in a negative direction, so we call it damage. So you hear a lot of people talking about plants damaging things. That's what we're talking about. It's not necessarily that they're breaking another plant or physically damaging it. It's that they're causing problems on the landscape. And this is, just to show that, this is a picture of central Illinois river bottomland. And this is a stand of bush honeysuckle. A lot of us are familiar with bush honeysuckle. And what do we see growing under there? Not a lot of anything, right? So this, in the areas that there wasn't the honeysuckle, it was lush, it had tons of native plants. It was actually kind of hard to walk through. There was so many native plants in there. But where the honeysuckle was, it was literally dirt, and that was about it. So that's a major negative consequence. There's no native plants there. That's damage. And we do have a sordid history with invasive species, right? So I tend to collect these old pamphlets from yesteryear. And so these are from the 50s, I think. And so this one on the left is from the USDA, and it talks about why you should plant multiflora rows and how good it is, right? And then the one on the right is also from the USDA, and it's talking about how good autumn olive is for wildlife and other conservation uses. The funny thing is the wildlife they chose is the exotic ringneck pheasant. But this is where we started with exotic species, right? We thought bringing something new would bring new resources or new opportunities for our wildlife. So we thought it was the best thing. People brought these over with the best of intentions, where they had benefits, they were going to be useful, and we were trying to do the best for our systems, not understanding that they're not going to stay put. They're not going to just be where they were planted, but they're going to spread, and the impacts, the consequences of them being on the landscape far outweigh any wildlife benefits. But we kind of were self-inflicted here a little bit, right, with some of these things. And in fact, if you look at the data, there's some neat research out there that 82% of our woody invasive plants started out as horticultural plants. There's the honeysuckle, which you've got to admit, that's kind of a pretty plant, right? I mean, you can call it ugly in certain situations, but that's a pretty plant. It was a horticultural plant. I've seen it planted in people's yards and pruned and all this. And overall, over 60% of our invasive plants in the U.S. were intentionally introduced, either for horticulture or agriculture or some other reason. So again, it's kind of a weird situation where we planted things, we brought things over, and then kind of the stuff hit the fan and we realized, oh, this is not a good idea. And it's really been the last probably 30 years or so that 25 to 30 years that most people have recognized this is not a good idea, and they see that our native plants actually have more benefits, and we really need to move back in that direction. So it's been this seismic shift over the last few decades in conservation, understanding that exotic plants are bad and we need to move away from them, and how our native ecosystems are really better for wildlife and better for the ecosystems. So how do these plants become invasive? What makes a plant a problem? Well, they have a ability, mostly from not having any kind of pests or diseases or anything that impact them in this new environment. They can capture resources quicker, right? All plants need certain things to grow, and oftentimes these invasives in the new environment are better at capturing these resources. They're better at getting water, sunlight, space, nutrients. And in a competition where there's a lot of plants trying for the same things, right? They're all going for the same water, all going for the same nutrients. The plant that's a little better, a little faster, a little more efficient is going to win out. And so these invasives are kind of free from those checks and balances. A lot of our insects don't feed on them. There's not a lot of native diseases on them or anything. They're able to just kind of win this competition and push out the natives. And that's really how they end up becoming invasive. And we see things with these invaders, like they often have very, very high seed production. Multiflora rose, one multiflora rose bush can make 1 million seeds, for example. Effective seed dispersals, maybe wind or birds or hanging on animals. Some just grow really early, like garlic mustard. It grows quicker than a lot of the other plants and it does its thing earlier. And others just have a longer growing season. We know with bush honeysuckle, it leaves out a couple weeks earlier than any of our native shrubs and stays green about 3 weeks later than any of our native shrubs. That's over a month more photosynthesis it does every year. So it's no surprise it's going to grow more, right? So there's some strategies that we see popping up again and again with invasive plants. Some will do allelopathy, right? So basically chemical warfare where they actually change the chemical composition of the soil to favor them. A lot of plants do this. We all know black walnut does that. But we're finding a lot of our invasive species have some level of allelopathy where they're changing the soil. No, you're fine. I was going to say, back in the day, I had a guy who was doing a talk, and he said, if anybody's phone goes off, they have to stand up and sing "I'm a Little Teapot," including the hand motions. But I'm not going to do that. So, that was funny. So in terms of kind of another reason why invasive species are a problem, or why they kind of are really bad through here, is that sometimes our environments are disturbed or our environments are impacted from other ways that give an invasive species kind of a head start. And we're seeing some of these other things through research now that kind of work in tandem with invasive species. And one is deer. We know that higher populations of white-tailed deer often help invasive species because a lot of our invasives, they just don't eat them. Like they don't really eat garlic mustard. And if garlic mustard's growing there, they eat the other plants, their native plants next to them. It lets the garlic mustard grow a little more. And so we're seeing this combination of high deer populations impacting our native plants and opening up space for those invasives. And so that's one thing that's really people are starting to understand more and more now, is that that's kind of a 1-2 punch. Also just disturbances, right? This is some research that came out of the University of Illinois, looking at tornadoes and windstorms and finding that kind of disturbance, that light into the environment, is an open niche for invasive species, and they're just going to jump right in there, right? They're going to move into those environments. And so kind of disturbances on the landscape, high deer populations, edge habitats. So this was some study out of Indiana that said that invasive species show up along the edges first, right? They like the edges of forest and they make their way into the interior. They like that highlight environment and kind of moving in from there. And so what have we done? We've carved up a lot of our forest into smaller blocks. There's a lot more edge now than there used to be, so there's a lot more opportunity for these invasives to kind of get a foothold. And then I had to throw this one in here just because it was my research and I just wanted to show it off, even though it was a long time ago. But I found, this was my thesis research, the spatial arrangement of woodlands and how that impacts invasive species. It was not groundbreaking research. It basically said the more fragmented a landscape is, the more invasive species you get. Again, not groundbreaking, but it applies. It's applicable, so I can kind of put it up here, right? I'm going to brag a little bit. All right, and so that's kind of why or how invasive species move around, but why are we worried about them? What actually do they do? What kind of impacts? And we kind of recognize them universally. People are understanding they're a problem now. It's listed as one of the 4 major threats to our U.S. forest and grasslands by the Forest Service. And even in the Illinois Wildlife Action Plan, invasive species is one of the 6 primary challenges to conservation in Illinois. So we understand it's not just me, it's kind of all the natural resource managers are understanding this is a big deal, right? This is something that it's kind of a challenge for us to deal with. It's because these impacts from invasive species, they can lead to loss of species diversity. You can actually lose species, native species, out of the environment due to these invasive species. You have less natives in there. Ecosystem functions can change. That could be water holding capacity. It could be the ability to burn. It could be nutrient cycling. All these different functions that our forest and our grasslands do are going to be altered by invasives. You can lose productivity. If you're looking at selling timber, invasive species can make your timber grow slower. That's money out of your pocket. And it can change wildlife habitat. These are all different ways that invasive species can directly impact the things that we love, right? And so this is kind of a story, right? So this is a picture that tells one of the worst stories of invasive species. So who wants to venture a guess of what I'm looking at here? What's that? Yeah, chestnut. Everybody knows the story of American chestnut, right? American chestnut at one time was one of the most abundant trees in the eastern United States, primarily in the Appalachians. It was a linchpin of ecosystems, food for wildlife, food for people. It was a major, major part of the ecosystems in the eastern United States. And then we brought over chestnuts from other parts of the world. Along with that came chestnut blight, was a little disease that our native chestnuts, American chestnut, had basically almost no resistance to. And so they started dying right away. And so we went basically in a matter of about three or four decades from being one of the most abundant trees in the United States to almost being extinct in the wild. Right? That's a major change on the landscape due to an invasive. We're seeing something similar right now in Illinois from that little fella right there, which I'm sure you guys know what that is. Yeah, that's emerald ash borer, right? So emerald ash borer is a little exotic insect that's killing every ash tree, right? 90+% of our ash trees are dying due to this insect, right? And we're losing this whole genus of trees out of our woods in Illinois, and we're expected that we're going to lose somewhere around 150 million trees, over time. This was, and this is a stand here. This is Williamson County in southern Illinois, and these are all ashes, right? They're all dying. And it was a place that I was going to go in there with my boy, and we were going to go turkey hunting. And we said, nope, we're not going to go in there because these trees are falling all over the place, and it was too dangerous, right? But it was just an amazing alteration where in the matter of about 10 years. So it first showed up in Williamson County. It was first found in Williamson County in 2015. And so this was 2022. So yeah, 7 years basically. It went from being not even known from there to having forests look like this. It's a big issue. This is kind of the gloom and doom part of this talk. I'm really hoping Ray is going to be the sunshine, the ray of sunshine when I'm done. It works? All right. All right, a few more just kind of gloom and doom stuff here before I get into the good stuff. But bush honeysuckle, right? There's some really neat research out of Ohio looking at stands of forests that have bush honeysuckle. And they found that the trees, the big mature overstory trees, if they get bush honeysuckle underneath of them, it's such a good competitor that it's slowing the growth rate of those trees, sometimes by as much as 50%. It's a big change, right? And then something like autumn olive can form a thicket so dense that you can't even go through there. I would not want to walk through there no matter how many mushrooms are found in there, although I would probably try. Garlic mustard, as we mentioned earlier, unpalatable to most of our wildlife, and it's replacing a lot of our native species. These are just some of these ways we're worried about them. Roundleaf bittersweet, this is a tree killer, right? So it's climbing up into the trees, weighing them down, breaking the trees, or shading them out. And there's just impacts directly to wildlife too. There's some interesting research out there showing that these invasive shrubs can change the habitat for our wildlife in a way that it may increase nest predation. So rats, snakes, and raccoons are eating more of the nest because of the placement of the nest for shrub nesting birds in invaded forest versus native forest. Or they can even, the leaves falling into the streams can alter the chemistry of the water such that different insects can live in there. It changes the insects. Really weird things. Or, especially honeysuckle that leaves out so early in the spring, it's capturing that light that a lot of reptiles need to warm themselves up when they come out of their hibernacula. They come out usually when the sunshine is going, the leaves aren't on our trees, and now everything's shaded from this honeysuckle. They can't get enough warmth in there and they leave, right? So there's some really weird changes. And so this is just this is a table that I pulled from the Illinois Wildlife Action Plan. So this is a plan in Illinois that talks about our species in greatest need of conservation. What wildlife species do we most need to focus on? And so these are just different groups of wildlife, and here's the total number of species they call species in greatest need of conservation. And then this is the percent of those species that are threatened by invasive species, specifically listed as invasive species are one of the problems. 63% of all these species in greatest need of conservation are threatened by invasive species. It's a pretty drastic number, right? So this is just kind of showing the scope of things. And this is not an invasive species, but it's a cool story. Anybody know what this is? A what trillium? It's a trillium, but it's not a prairie trillium. This is actually a state listed green trillium. So green trillium, trillium, yep. But it's a green trillium, Trillium viridae, rare. It's globally rare, only found in a handful of spots. I think something like 8 spots in Illinois it's known from or something. So I took the picture because I like plants, and I said, oh, I'm gonna take a great picture of a rare plant, a green trillium. I bet Terry knows exactly where this spot was. But you might have been the one that showed it to me, I can't remember. But after I took the picture, I started looking, well, what else is in this picture? And so everything red is Japanese honeysuckle, and the purple is roundleaf bittersweet, right? So this plant's in trouble, right? If we're not gonna do anything, these really kind of dense, thicket-forming vines are just gonna grow over and shade it out. And this is a globally rare plant. The upside of things is we didn't just do nothing, right? So this is on a DNR site. They worked on it. They controlled the invasives. They put fire in there, which is what that plant needs. And at first, the population had something like 7 individuals that were flowering. And the last count I heard of, it was up to over 100. So it was really neat work, like really directed at saving an individual population of a rare plant. And it worked. It's working, which is really neat. And so what are some of the bad actors we have out there? And again, you all know these. Bush honeysuckle is one of the major ones. We see stands like this, unfortunately, around. But there's others. If you go into northern Illinois, the buckthorns are the biggest issue. A lot of their woods are going to be looking like this. Garlic mustards across the state. We've mentioned it several times. It's a major issue as well. And it has stands that look like that. A couple other, autumn olive in our open lands is a bigger issue. It's actually kind of a pretty plant too, isn't it? And our forests sometimes look like this, or open woods. Roundleaf bittersweet, which we just mentioned as a tree killer. Some shots of it up into trees. And then just a couple more. Tree of Heaven. Right, does everybody know Tree of Heaven? Yeah, Tree of Heaven's an interesting one. If you ever read the book A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, this is the tree that grows in Brooklyn. But major issue, it has some health issues for people. It's a host to a spotter and lanternfly, which is a major pest that we may be getting. And just a smelly tree, if you ever smelled it. But anyway, that's another one. You have big stands like this. And then more of a newer one is our Callery pears, our Bradford pears. You drive around here about a month from now, you drive around and you're going to see flowering white trees everywhere on the roadsides. All of those trees you're going to be looking at are Bradford pears or Callery pears, right? Our roadsides that look like this are all escaped pears. It's kind of one of our newer, really problematic and growing invasives nowadays. So that's kind of the invasives. I want to mention a couple things here on, like, specifically when we're talking about managing our natural lands. We're talking here about Cardinal Ridge, a great natural forest. Kind of how specifically do invasive species impact natural environments? And so to get into that, I'll talk about just a slide or two of managing natural lands. Why do we manage natural lands? We have some goals, right? We want to preserve or enhance those ecological features. We want to restore or recreate, recreate natural communities. and we want to promote native species. These are some of the reasons why we manage natural lands, right? And we like sites like this, hill prairies, right? Glades, forest. All these areas are places that we value, we love, they're natural communities, we want to protect them. Right? So there's Illinois Nature Preserve and a ton of blue-eyed Marys, right? I love that shot. So these are the good things. And so we do manage these, but the problem with invasive species is they impact our goals, right? Our goal of preserving or enhancing these ecological features of our natural areas, invasive species can change those ecological features, can change the hydrology, the nutrient cycling, the fire regime on a landscape. They directly impact that goal. Our goal of recreating natural ecosystems, natural communities, we know invasive species alter habitat structure, species dominance, species evenness, take species diversity down. They increase how much it costs to manage our natural areas, and then also just the success of that management, as well as the quality of that ecosystem for wildlife and other organisms. So it directly impacts that goal of why we manage our natural areas. And then the last one, just our native species, protecting our native species. We know invasive species directly impact our native species, reduce population sizes, add stressors to them, cause local extinctions, local extirpations, all these things, right? So invasive species impact every goal that we have for natural community management. And so we have sites like this, right? These are unfortunately private or public lands, where we have autumn olive there, Japanese honeysuckle there, round leaf bittersweet there. It's like they're ganging up on us. And then this, I hesitate to use this shot, but I will, because you see the sign there, and then you see all this stilt grass behind it, right? That's not what we want to see. We want to see this sign with a beautiful native diverse community behind it. And so we manage these natural communities in a lot of ways, right? We mimic the historic disturbance regime. We add fire, we flood, we make graze, we restore habitat structure, we plant things, we change the hydrology, and we control invasive species. That's why with natural area management, invasive species control is always one of the things that's added in that you have to do on these natural communities. As you're doing all these other practices, that's one of those that's just kind of automatically added in there because we know it's such a big issue that we have to do it. Right? And so we do invasive species management. Things buzzing on me. This is just a shot to show that I don't just stay up on the computer. Every once in a while I go outside. I will say that, look how dark my beard is, so this is a very old picture. But we get out there, we have volunteers out there. We're out there controlling invasive species. This is an excuse to put my kids. There's two of my kids in the picture. This is also an old picture because my daughter there is now 20. And we do work, right? We use herbicides, we use tools, we use chainsaws, all for a goal of reducing these invasive species on the landscape. Sometimes we use heavy equipment to get the work done when it's bad enough and it's warranted. And we use things like prescribed fire, which can have a big impact on invasive species when used in the right way. So I'll kind of end just basically, what do? We as interested citizens of Illinois, as landowners, as potential volunteers, as folks that are just concerned, what can we do to do this? One of the simplest things is use or promote non-invasive or native alternatives. Stop using invasive species. Don't plant barberry and burning bush and Bradford pear in your yard. Try something different, right? Don't use invasive species. So I'm not just a spokesman, I'm a member, right? Or whatever that old saying was. This is my lawn that we put in our house, and so that's my garage right there. And this is an area that we try to put all in native species, and it's my favorite place on our farm at all, just because of how alive this is in the summer with the eruption of insects, butterflies, wasps, bees, everything there. It's really a wonderful place to be. It's all native species. Right? And in Illinois, we have so many neat plants. We literally have cool flowers that are native and every color of the rainbow out there. It took me forever to figure out how to make that slide and make it go wee around. So I literally use that in every presentation. If I'm talking about Asian carp, I'm still going to use this slide. So, controlling invasive species. If you have invasive species on your land, controlling those. We talked a lot about that already. That's something simple. Get them out of there. Reduce those population sizes. Something simple to do. And I like this quote from the Nature Conservancy in terms of why we control invasive species. So I'll just put it here. And they say, we control invasive species because they're harming the native plants and animals we care so much about protecting. That's why we're controlling them. It's not that we hate the invasives, we want to kill them, right? It's that we have something we want to protect, right? We have native species, native ecosystems that we care about, and the way to protect those is to remove invasive species. That's why we're doing that work. The other thing you can do is volunteer. If you have time and capacity, get out there and help do some of this on public lands or on other people's lands. It's amazingly effective. We toured the Cardinal Ridge today, and I was blown away by the amount of progress and amount of work that was done there by volunteers. People dedicating and just spending their time of their own free will doing really good work that benefits all of us as public landowners. It's a simple step you can do, but it's amazingly powerful. This is a group of folks that volunteered to spend a day with me out in the woods mapping invasive species. We hiked through actually a wilderness area on the Shawnee National Forest in the winter and mapped like 200 different little populations of invasive species. It was one of the most fun days that I've had at work in years. It was really fantastic. And all these folks weren't getting paid, right? They were just out there on their own free will because they were interested in helping. Really, really impactful and amazing work they did. Also just volunteer days, right? Here's another picture of my daughter. I'm gonna slide those in there. Right, out there just volunteering, pulling garlic mustard. She was voluntold that she was gonna do this, right? But everybody else kind of came on their own decision. And you know, there's other things you can do. There's been really neat work across the state with Illinois Master Naturalists. Anybody know that program? Anybody here a Master Naturalist? A couple of you? So Master Naturalist, which is a University of Illinois extension program, it's a little plug if you're interested, but went out and put and installed boot brush stations at trailheads across the state. I forgot how many they put out there, but really did great work. It's just something simple that people can do as education, but also clean their boots off and kind of prevent seeds from spreading around. That is my other daughter, right? So that's a cool picture. And that's my boot. So I'm showing that my foot is very famous. It made it into a story in Outdoor Illinois years ago. The other thing you can do is learn about our native ecosystems. Learn what a native plant is and why it's so important. Learn our native ecosystems and why we care about them. Get out there and discover some more of this. That's something that is simple, but it's actually really powerful for more people to be advocates for our native species. It's something that can really help with managing natives and working on invasive species. It's just having those people supportive. So getting out there and volunteering, but also just learning. So groups like the Native Plant Society and the Illinois Master Naturalist are great opportunities to get involved and get more knowledgeable. There's good resources out there like Illinois Wildflowers, Forest Trees of Illinois, or you can just get into programs. This is a kayak botany tour that we've done a couple times where we float around a lake, we stop at the shoreline, and we talk about the native wetland plants. It's kind of fun, and it's a sneaky way to get in a kayak on the work time. So I really like it. So I'm going to keep doing this more and more. And then finally, spread the word, right? Tell other people. I like this little spread the word and not the weeds. But just get out there and tell more people about what you're doing, what's happening here, why you're concerned about invasive species. There's a lot of simple things you can do like that. Again, just to kind of build more effort and more enthusiasm or momentum to deal with invasive species. Again, I was so impressed by the work that's happening here at the park by this volunteer group, and I'd really like to see more of that happen. So I hope everybody else starts little groups or volunteers with your group too. And I think that's what I had. So I'm going to turn it over to Ray next, right? Yep. clip it on and stick it in your pocket.
Well, first of all, as Terry said, I'm Ray Geroff. I'm a district heritage biologist with the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. I'm based out of Pittsfield, Illinois, District 15. That's been expanded to cover about 14 counties now with our current staffing levels. So Menard County is one of those. I pretty much cover everything between the Illinois and Mississippi River from Hancock County south through Calhoun, Cass, Morgan, Scott, and Menard on this side of the Illinois River. So decent sized area. My main focus is on state lands and on high quality natural areas. So my main focus is threatened endangered species, sites on what we call the Illinois Natural Area Inventory, which is an inventory of our highest quality remaining natural areas in the state. But then in addition to that, I work on obviously all of our other state lands. And so New Salem is a state historic site. It's not one of our state parks. It's not one of our state fish and wildlife areas or one of those type of sites that was obtained for outdoor recreational use or per se for its natural resources. It's due to its actual historical significance. So the site isn't as focused on natural area management in the past. And so, as Terry has said, it has got quite a few invasive and exotic species present, and that's what Menard County's Trails and Greenways has been working towards. They've started a project out here to obviously up on Cardinal Ridge, Cardinal Hill Trail. That has been the main focus of it. So a little bit about the history. I took over Menard County probably around 2018, I think, is when it became assigned to me. And I hadn't been to New Salem State Historic Site since I was a little kid when I came here on a field trip for school. And so then I came back, I did a little bit of work at the park with the site staff and kind of not much else. And then I heard that there was a group in the area, Menard County Trails and Greenways, that was maybe interested in trying to help out at the park with controlling these invasive and exotic species. And so looked at different things, evaluated the site, and obviously in 2020, as Terry mentioned, we started discussing an agreement and trying to move something forward through DNR. And we all know how government is, things are slow. There's all kinds of hurdles, all kinds of hoops we had to jump through. We had to get a lot of things figured out. So we got through that. We had a Zoom meeting. It was one of the few Zoom meetings I've been on. I'm not a big technology person. I'm glad Chris told me not to hit this button on the remote because otherwise I wouldn't have known to not hit that button. So we had a Zoom meeting with some of the membership of Menard County's Trails and Greenways to see if they were interested in pursuing a project, who would be interested, and kind of to figure things out a little more. And so after that, we developed, Terry has been great in developing a lot of the necessary paperwork and documents needed to get this going. And so we had a work plan that was created, as she discussed, which kind of outlined what was expected from each side, what was expected from Menard County's Trails and Greenways, what was expected from DNR, and the different people involved. Basically to get everybody on the same page, so that way you don't have 20 people show up out on a state site with chainsaws, cutting stuff down, spraying chemicals, and the site soup going, what's going on over here? Calls the law enforcement, has them all arrested and locked up for trying to do good work. Sad part is that has occurred in some places. So work really began in 2021. The Cardinal Hill area is obviously the point where most work has been created, but there's also been substantial work that was done over here by the statue, which is a major focal point of this site. Obviously, Karen, many of you know her, has been one of the most hardworking, most involved people in this project on the ground, and she did a lot of work there, and with some help of some other people, and has done some planting of native species in the area to try to make the area look more appealing and not just be a giant wall of honeysuckle hiding a parking lot behind Lincoln statue. So But most of all the other work has been done up on the Cardinal Ridge area. There's been honeysuckle removal through various means, loppers, brush cutters, chainsaws, all of that. Garlic mustard pulls. There's been multiple, I couldn't tell you how many bags Terry's told me that they've pulled of garlic mustard between the volunteers, the 4-H groups, the Girl Scouts, and just all these other people that have been pulled in to help. It's been amazing to me for such a small site and more of a rural community, how well it's all come together, because I cover most of my other counties are all rather rural counties, and none of them have anything this good going on with a volunteer group. So it's really impressive. And so they've been working hard on that. 2022 progress has been made, a lot of progress. More honeysuckle was removed. We got prescribed fire back on the place. Garlic mustard was removed. In 2023, it's off to an amazing start. I mean, we're in February and there's been an immense amount of work done already. So as Chris said in his presentation, which him and I didn't even talk before this, but I was watching his, I'm like, wow, our presentations actually go together pretty good. So he talked about goals, and so our goals for this project identified are pretty much exactly like what he was saying. We're wanting to restore, maintain the historic character of the forest by getting rid of the invasive species. And so by getting rid of the invasive species, what we're wanting to promote are the hardwood species that would have been more characteristic of this area, the oaks and the hickories of most note. So how are we going to accomplish this? Another thing like Chris touched on. So we've got some different methods that we're going to use. Mechanical methods, chemical methods, prescribed fire, and hours of hard work. This bottom one is the most important of all of them. No matter whether it's on New Salem, whether it's on your own private property, all of these methods here are the same things you're going to use. They're all important. So the mechanical methods that have been employed out here at New Salem is hand pulling, obviously, of the garlic mustard. There's been also hand pulling of some of the smaller honeysuckles that are able to be pulled out by hand. But then there's also been a lot of cutting done. That's what the lion's share of the work's been completed with chainsaws, brush cutters, loppers, hand saws. Basically anything that can cut it down has been used, I think, out here to cut it down. And then to make it look nice and to help promote the ability to get rid of all of this large amount of biomass that they're removing of these invasive species, you can see they're being piled. And so if you go walk out there on this trail, you're going to see all these brush piles all around. Those brush piles, one, they're aesthetically pleasing because you don't have just a mat of cut up, sawed up material laying all over the forest floor. But also it creates more habitat for wildlife as well. There's a lot of songbirds, a lot of insects, a lot of small mammals and things like that will use those as habitat. So you're helping out more wildlife as well. And then if you go to look at other parts of New Salem currently, the site has a skid steer with a mulcher on it. They've been trying to start doing some mulching of these invasive species, and I believe that this group's heading that way too with some of the funds that they have to get some of the real dense areas hit with a forestry mulcher. So these are all the mechanical means that are going to be used to do this. You can't just wave a magic wand and they disappear. You have to physically go out and get rid of them somehow. And so you can't just do one method. If you just go out there and you cut all this honeysuckle, or you cut all the multiflora rose, or the autumn olive, or whatever species you're working with, it's going to resprout. It's going to come back. And so these plants are very resilient. That's what makes them very good invaders and able to persist, is you cut them off, they're not dead. So unless you treat them with a chemical that's going to ultimately disrupt their functions, they're going to resprout, and you may have had 4 stems here, but then this is going to resprout into 12 stems or 14 stems. And the more times you cut it, the more stems you're going to get. And it's just not going to quit. They're going to be just as persistent as you are unless you treat the stumps. And so when they're cutting, they're doing the stump treatments for this Roundup and the species that they're cutting out there. We're using a mixture of water and Roundup to treat the stumps. And one thing you got to remember, if you're cutting large items, the only part of the stump that you really have to worry about treating is this outer edge, because this is where your vascular tissues are that are moving the chemical and moving the nutrients from the soil to the leaves and back and forth. And so the center part is actually, in essence, dead. The wood part is dead. It's not going to translocate that chemical. So if you have large stumps, you don't have to spray the entire stump. You can spray that outer edge, and that's going to be sufficient enough. You can also do foliar treatments. You can use backpack sprayers. To do that, you can use ATV sprayers. Anything that's going to spray the chemical in an efficient manner is going to be effective. For honeysuckle and a lot of these small shrub species, Roundup is kind of our go-to. Sometimes, like with garlic mustard, you can still spray it with Roundup in some of its stages. Another method that there is called basal bark treatment, which is where you don't actually cut the tree down or cut the bush down. You actually use a oil carrier with your herbicide. Many times it's triclopure with basil oil. And this doesn't work as good on honeysuckle, but works really good on autumn olive. And like Chris mentioned, tree of heaven, if you're working with tree of heaven, that's one species where you do not want to cut it. If you cut it, and even if you treat the stumps, it's still going to get angry and send up a whole ton of shoots. So you more want to kill it while it's standing. And so this basal bark treatment actually tricks the plant into thinking that it's still alive, so it doesn't send up all of its shoots, and it takes the chemical down and kills the tree before it can send up all of its resprouts. So depending on what species you're looking at, depends on what chemical and what method you're going to want to use. And many times you have to couple all these methods together for an efficient treatment on your property, whether it's state ground, your property, or wherever you're working. Prescribed fire. I spend a large amount of my time at work on prescribed fire. If you saw smoke coming out of Jim Edgar on Monday, that was me burning. I burned off about 600 acres out there on Monday. We try to burn roughly, the past 4 years or so now, we've tried to roughly burn 5,000 acres out there a year because it's supposed to be a grassland site, and so we're really trying to knock these woody species back. Some of the other species out there we're battling, we can talk about later, Serratia lespedeza and some of those, but they're not a concern out here at New Salem that the Menard County Trails and Greenways is working with. But prescribed fire, this was the first drop of fire. This is the picture I take. For my burn reporting, I have to report the time I started the fire, the time it was contained, the time that we mopped it up, all of that. So I always take a picture when I drop the fire on the ground so I can look back at my phone and get that information from it. So this was the first drop of fire dropped on New Salem in we don't even know how many years for a prescribed fire. And so these were the fire lines we lit through the woods, through the project area. This is Cardinal Ridge Trail right here and right here. You can go out there and find this log still out there. And then this is the end result. Some areas burned better than others. The first time we put fire out there, it wasn't what a lot of people would think is a textbook fire for burning through these oak woodlands. You didn't have the whole woods wasn't black underneath. It was partially due to timing and moisture content, but it's also because of the mesification that has occurred there, which we'll get into in just a little bit. But why do you want to put fire on your place or on a state site like this? It helps suppress some of that undesirable woody growth. So when the fire goes through, it at least top kill a lot of those smaller shrubs or yearling honeysuckles or autumn olives or any of those species. Stem reduction. So oaks and hickories are shade intolerant species. So if it's a very shaded area, such as Cardinal Ridge was with all the honeysuckle, that was pretty much you had an overstory of honeysuckle, and then you had the overstory of trees. You could walk through a lot of that and look up and not see trees. All you saw was honeysuckle. And so that shade has prevented a lot of the regeneration of the oaks and hickories in that area. Nutrient cycling, when you do these prescribed fires, it helps cycle all those nutrients that are still in the leaf litter and the biomass that's on the ground. Garlic mustard, honeysuckle control, like I said a minute ago, and then reduce that mesification. And so what mesification means over time is it's becoming more of a mesic area, more moist, a wetter area altogether. These woods would have been a lot drier. They're on a ridge top. They would have had a lot of winds moving through them, which would have kept the soil drier, which would have helped prevent a lot of this understory clutter that's there now with the honeysuckle and things like that. And so you need that drying through there to promote your oaks and your hickories that you're wanting there. And so it'll take 4 or 5 years of putting fire to this unit for it to get put back into a more as you would call it, textbook burnable unit, where you'll have more area that turns black like this. It's going to take a while because you have to get those oaks and those hickories to start getting the leaves back to the ground. A lot of the areas had been fully covered with honeysuckle, so there was no leaf litter underneath it. As Chris said, in a lot of areas where these invasives are, it's dirt underneath these things. And dirt doesn't burn, so you can't carry fire with it. So trying to get prescribed fire back in is going to take a little bit, but if we keep after it, we'll get it. So where has Menard Counties and Trails Greenways mostly worked? If you're familiar with the old restaurant, that's still somewhat standing up there. It's right there. And so here's the entrance to the trail. And so they originally started in this area right here, and then they've just gone through the entire purple area. So the first goal they did was the inside loop of Cardinal Hill Trail, and then now this past year they've really gone to the outside of it and have been cleaning it all up as well. They've done an immense amount of work. I haven't seen a volunteer group ever do this good of work and this much work in such a short amount of time. It's rather amazing. They've covered approximately 32 acres out there, which is a lot. That's great on any state, on state sites where we're even hiring contractors and stuff. It's good if you get 32 acres treated. That's amazing. So the results. So beforehand, this picture down here on the bottom left is pretty much what you were looking at. When you looked out in those woods, you'd walk down the trail, you looked around, that's what you seen. And now these are the pictures that I took just a week or two ago out there. You can see there are piles of honeysuckle scattered throughout the woods. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 piles just in that picture there. And you can see the mature hardwood species are still there. And so they're starting to put more of that leaf litter down. And so as long as we can get to a period of time where we catch a good weather window with the right winds to not smoke the highway, we'll get a fire to run through there. And that'll help out a lot with that nutrient cycling, reduction of new stems of invasive and exotic species. And so if you want to compare your leaf litter there to the leaf litter here, this is a lot thicker and a lot more contiguous, where this is a lot more broken up and more flat to the ground. Because when you're trying to burn, the oak leaves, they kind of curl, if you ever notice, on the ground, which then allows the fire to go to them, and there's air underneath it. If you try to light a book on fire and it's all closed up, it doesn't burn. But if you feather the pages out, the pages will burn. It's the same thing with the leaves in the woodlands. You need that air. If they're packed down tight, they're not going to burn. So it's not going to carry the fire efficiently. So the results that they've accomplished, they have, in the area they've worked, they have a much more open understory, which is allowing those winds to start coming back through more and more, which is going to help reduce that mesification. It's going to help reverse that. It's not an irreversible thing, so we're taking steps in the right direction, which will ultimately get us to higher quality oak and hickory woodland, which is the end goal of this project, is that we have a high quality oak hickory woodland that we can put on that, as I said, the Illinois Natural Area Inventory earlier, because then it is a high quality site. It's a good designation if we can get these woodlands to that point. So here I took this is actually 2 pictures, and I did the best I could to seam it right here. If you look, I took this picture. This is one side of the trail, and this is the other side. This side here hasn't been worked on. This side here has been. You can see their piles over in there. And this is work they've done this past fall and so far into this year. And you can see the leaf litter. This was all covered in honeysuckle. You can see a lot of soil gaps. You see a lot of soil there. It makes it harder for that fire to carry versus that contiguous oak litter that I showed in those previous pictures. And then you can see the mess that they're working their way into. And hats off to them. When you look at these walls of honeysuckle and you start cutting, you're like, oh, it won't take me that long. And then by the time you're done cutting through 10 bushes, you're like, it's been a half hour. And you almost feel defeated, but they haven't. You guys have been very resilient. You've worked very hard, and you've done a lot of work. So just briefly, I want to talk about a couple other area conservation initiatives that are ongoing, because I knew that there's going to be a lot of people asking about their private lands here. And so Menard County's Trails and Greenways obviously has many opportunities if you're just wanting to get involved in conservation or get involved in doing things for the natural world that are beneficial, from New Salem to Adopt a Highway to river cleanups, the list goes on. And then one of the ones that's associated with Illinois Department of Natural Resources is the Illinois Recreational Access Program, which is a program that provides hunting opportunities or recreational opportunities to the general public on private land. So private landowners sign their property up in this, they receive a rental payment, and then in exchange for allowing a certain number of either youth or first-time hunters or other users to utilize their property for recreational purposes. It's a very controlled program. Like I know a landowner that had 500 acres, they signed up in it. They leased out like 3 of the turkey seasons, and each season they could have like 4 hunters on the property. So it's not like, and those hunters are chosen through a lottery system. It's not just open to the public. It's they have to apply, they have to get approved, and it's only those people. So it's a very controlled system. There's insurance liability waivers, or insurance that's covered through the state for the landowners involved, for the people on it. But it also, we have these what we call strike teams that are associated with that program. One of them is funded and based with Pheasants Forever, and another one's based out of National Great Rivers Research and Education Center down out of Godfrey. And so those teams have anywhere 3 to 4 people on them, and they come out to these private lands that are enrolled, and they do invasive and exotic species control on these properties. They're instituting honeysuckle removal, timber stand improvement practices, prescribed fire, those type of things on these properties, and providing that technical assistance to the landowners as well to get work done. So if you have property, you might be interested in that program, I can get you in contact with the right people, or you can go to our website and you can find it, and you can do that. It's a very good tool to get some work done on your property if you're okay with maybe leasing out a couple of your hunting seasons to youth or whatever the programs you choose are. The next one is probably one of my biggest things that I've been working on for the past roughly 6 years now, and it's the Illinois Hill Prairie Partnership. And so there's these unique prairies that are on these lush deposits, lush soil deposits that are home to many endangered and threatened species and rare plants. And the reason why a lot of these still exist is because many of you probably farm. If you can farm one of these hill slopes, I'd be pretty impressed. But that's why they still exist. They were mostly grazed lands. And so these areas are areas that I'm doing a lot of work on, and we've got a lot of partners involved. But the biggest partner is the private landowners. And then we have funding coming from various different places, whether it's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Conservation Fund, Pheasants Forever, Quail Forever, the National Wild Turkey Federation, Apex Clean Energy, TC Energy, and even Illinois Rural Electric. They've all partnered with us. They've provided financial assistance, and this is all done on, that money is all going on to private lands. So if any of you are hill prairie owners, we would definitely be interested in looking at projects on your property. This is what most hill prairies look like these days, and covered in cedar, eastern red cedar, covered in locust, honeysuckle, autumn olive, hedge, all those species that come up in those pastures after you're done. And so what we do is we come in and we remove those and then turn it into a prairie. This here photo, oh gosh, Chris, you didn't tell me about all these other buttons. This photo here was taken 2 years before this photo here. That's 2 years. So here's a couple, this is the area where we're working, that we currently have projects. And you can see we do include Menard County in this focus area, but we don't currently have any projects over here. So if any of you are hill prairie owners or know of hill prairie owners, we'd be very interested in exploring the possibilities. And this is a cost share program, so it's not, we don't cover 100% of the cost, but we cover as much as we can. Here's a few more before and afters. So you can see this project here, we cleared all of this area. It was mostly a lot of timber on there before we cleared it. here's another one. You can see the house for reference. This was what it looked like over here, and this part here was just cleared last. That was cleared last winter, and then we burned it this spring, and we got lucky, and they took an aerial photo of it, and so you can still see all the piles from where we burned everything up. And the next phase of the project is actually clearing over here. And this is the biggest one we've done. This one here had roughly about 60 acres we did of hill prairie. You can see you can see the relief in the hills here. You can see all these hills over here. Well, when you look at this picture, this is all cedar and hedge and locust. The same thing back over on these bottoms. And so this here picture is a 5-year difference on this picture here, this aerial photo. So on these sites I just showed you, this site here and this site here, within 2 years of clearing, we had 3 state endangered or threatened species, plant species, show back up. Not seeded, not introduced, just showed back up from the seed bank. So it's really cool, and it's something I'm really excited about, and it's something that I work a lot on. So those are some of the initiatives that we have on private lands. Obviously, public lands, Menard County Trails and Greenways is doing great work out here on Cardinal Ridge. This is they had this beautiful sign put together, explains the project out there for people that come and visit, to give them a quick info on it. If you haven't seen it, you should go check it out. I highly encourage you, if you haven't, to go walk that trail. It's really impressive what's been done there. It's a very good classroom experience per se, to see what invasive species could do for you on your property or on other state lands if you're interested in getting involved. And with that, if anybody has any questions, I think that's the next thing we're going to move to with Terry. If Chris wants to come back up here, we'll both take questions. Any questions you have, we'll be happy to try to answer.
Several questions in one. What's the best way to get rid of honeysuckle? What do you spray it with in the autumn olive? When's the best time of year to set Roundup? Also, you cut it off at the ground or about a foot or 2 off the ground and then shoot the stump. What's the best way to get rid of that?
So for honeysuckle, I always like to tell people to cut it as flush to the ground as you can for a couple of reasons. One, I don't like to walk through and fall over stumps. They're a tripping hazard, they're dangerous, you can fall on them, you can impale yourself, not really a great thing. So I always say cut them as low as you can. That's also less distance for the chemical to have to travel to get to the root system. For chemicals, for honeysuckle, I always pretty much use Roundup. If you're stump treating it, depending on which brand Roundup glyphosate you're getting, you need to read the label because every label is going to be different, and that's what's going to govern it. But for Roundup Pro Concentrate, which is what I get on state contract, I use up to a 50% solution on the stump. You can get it down all the way, depending on how you're applying, you could get it down to 20% and still be effective on the stump itself. And that's just mixing it with water. Now, if you're going to do foliar treatment, you can drop that all the way back. 2%. Cover that if you're doing a foliar treatment.
Best time of year to do the younger plants in the spring, then spray?
Yeah, I would. If you're doing foliar spray, the best time, and Chris would probably agree with me, is that 3 weeks that it's green before anything else is green, and the 3 weeks that it's green that nothing else is green.
You have to kind of wait a little bit. Too early in the spring, it may not be as well, but yeah, once it's fully leafed out in the spring is a great time. To do the cut stump, you can do it really any time of the year, kind of except for that initial green up. So in a couple weeks, those buds are going to be going to be erupting, and then you kind of want to stay away from doing that cut stump until those leaves are all the way out. But other than that, pretty much any time of year.
And can you notch it with Cordon or something? So if you don't have the time to cut 1,000 plants, can you just notch it with Cordon or Roundup and let it die? With autumn olive also?
You can, honestly, time you crawl in there and try to get in there to do a notch with those, you might as well just cut the whole thing down. I would be careful with Tordon, and I'm sure you could say the same thing, Ray, is that it does tend to move a little bit in the soil, and so I've seen cases where people use it underneath the trees that they want to keep, and it can actually impact those overstory trees. So it works really good maybe in areas where there's no overstory trees or you're not near water, but when you're in those areas that's a little more sensitive, you probably want to do the glyphosate instead.
Now for your autumn olive, that one there I have very good luck with basil bark treatment. So if you get triclopyr and some what's called basil oil, you can mix that 20% triclopyr into the basil oil, and you simply just spray that on the bottom 6 inches of the bush there, and as long as you get most of the way around it, it'll pretty well kill the autumn olives.
And I'll just add that Terry put some of these little guides out from our friends over in Indiana that have like phenology, have a little bit of timing and different control techniques. It's a good resource. There's some around on the tables, right?
It's like 10 copies, so first come, first
So
serve.
you got to
can
arm wrestle
download
for
it off
them.
the internet.
Anyway, so that's kind of a neat little resource. I have a cool book for Illinois, but I left it in my truck. Otherwise, you would. I forgot.
They'll wait.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of good online resources.
Did that answer your question, sir?
Yeah.
Would a prescribed burn be any use trying to control a smaller honeysuckle?
Yes. If you get a prescribed burn through honeysuckle the first couple of years that it's up, you'll definitely top kill it. And as long as you maintain a prescribed fire regime, usually at least once every 3 years, you'll keep a lot of all that new growth down. And
Is it best to do the burn when the plant's got leaves on it, or does it matter?
it doesn't matter as much. We start burning as soon as we can in the fall after leaf drop, and then we burn all the way through the spring until green up. I mean, you see a little bit better kill rate whenever it's starting to green up a little bit sometimes, it seems like, but it's not noticeably different.
That was 41% concentrate on your glyphosate.
Oh,
Yeah. Well,
I don't remember what the concentrate is.
so a lot of times if they're using the aquatic safe version, that's a 50% concentrate. Yeah,
Yeah.
like rodeo and stuff's 50%, but the other stuff, like Max, the Roundup Max, is 41%.
Yeah.
You don't need a surfactant if it's not foliar.
I don't use a
No.
surfactant if it's not foliar.
It's not foliar, you don't.
I do use dye sometimes, so that way then I can tell if I actually treated the stump or not. Because by the time you drop 6 of them on your head and you crawl out of there, you're like, did I treat that stump or not? So, and if you want a cheap dye, I mean, it's not a herbicide dye, but I know a lot of people are just using blue pond dye. You buy it by the gallon, and it works just as good. So.
Yeah, what do you suggest along a sandy creek for honeysuckle? In one sense, you might want to keep the erosion down, so I didn't know if it was best to cut it and spray it lightly just to keep it down or what?
So one, I would use an aquatic safe herbicide because you're in sandy soil where it moves more, you're near a creek. What we've done in some cases when we were worried about erosion or something, when we cut honeysuckle out, we actually sow like native grasses in there. So we put in river oats and like Virginia wild rye and plant it after we control the honeysuckle just to get something on the ground and get roots in those soils. We've had good luck with that. Yeah, basically.
We use a lot of rye for that.
Yeah. Yeah, in the back.
How are you controlling Japanese stilt grass?
We're controlling it poorly. No, so Japanese stiltgrass is it's an annual grass, right? So it basically lives purely through production of seed every year. So your main goal when you're controlling any annual, including stiltgrass, is to do something to prevent the seed set. So we use a combination of herbicides. So sometimes we use pre-emergent herbicides, which you put out in the spring, usually in early March or so, or you can do it a little later if you mix it with another herbicide. So that basically stays in the soil and it kills any of the seeds that are trying to germinate. If we have big stands of stiltgrass, we'll use that some. If you have a little bit of stiltgrass mixed with other plants, then we don't do that because it impacts the other plants. We actually have good luck with a grass-specific herbicide. So there's a couple, there's one called Envoy or Clethodim, and there's one called Post. And they kill grasses and don't kill other plants. And so since stiltgrass is an annual and a weak-rooted plant, we actually have some research, we're in year 2 now, where we use really light rates of that grass-specific herbicide. It kills the stiltgrass, and it doesn't even kill our native grasses. So the data is still to be crunched, but it looks like that's a pretty good effective method of killing stiltgrass and not impacting our native grasses. The other thing you can do is if you can get in an area where you can mow it before it flowers. It's going to flower usually starting in mid to late August. You can mow it or pull it before then. You don't want to do it after then because it's already setting seed.
And that's one way we see the seeds get spread is mowers.
Yes, yeah. If you mow it late, there's a problem.
If you discover a new invasion of something like stiltgrass, say in Menard County or somewhere, where do we report it? How should it be reported?
So for high priority ones, you probably want to talk to Ray. But in general, there's actually a smartphone app. It's called the EdMaps app, EDD Maps. It's got a long name, but anyway, it's an online, it's an app you put on your phone and you can actually enter invasive species data into it. And then I actually get an alert. I'll know what people enter into that. And it lets us map and know where these invasive species are. We've actually found new species in new counties and was able to go out and then react to them and manage them because of people putting them in those apps. That would be my recommendation. But if it's an important one, which I'd imagine stiltgrass is up here, Ray probably wants a phone call.
The sad part is stiltgrass is becoming more common.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm having a lot more reports of it, and it's spreading a lot through the creek systems and mowers on the roadsides,
Yep.
and it's becoming I'm getting more and more people every year. Sad.
I recommend everybody here, if you don't know what it is, learn what it is. Like I said, I came from Southern Illinois, and it is a huge problem down there, and you do not want to get it started on your property. Stilt, S-T-I-L-T, stiltgrass, Japanese stiltgrass.
Japanese stiltgrass. It's called stiltgrass because it has little aerial stilted roots. It looks kind of funny. Yeah.
You guys talk a lot about desirable trees, such as oaks, hickories. I understand that maples are not really desirable, is that correct?
Depends on location.
Yeah, so I'm not a maple hater at all. Maples are native. See, we have, 7 species in maple that's native to Illinois, 5 kind of common ones. And they're a native, normal part of our ecosystem. The issue with maples are, with this idea of our forest becoming more closed in over time with lack of fire and other disturbances, they're becoming more moist. And our maples were traditionally restricted some level to kind of north-facing slopes and lower on the topography. And they're kind of moving into these other sites that traditionally were more open and more dry. And so it's not that they're not desirable, it's that they're in places at higher levels than they were historically, and it's impacting other natives, I guess. When you say?
Yeah, I mean, basically an invasive species or an undesirable species is a species that's out of place. And so maples would not be on a ridge top normally. I mean, that's not where you would find them. They'd be, like he was saying, in the damper, moisture areas. But a lot of these ridge tops, as I was saying, like with Cardinal Hill, they've become damper through that mesophyte.